Hi there, Rabbi. Love your background. I have a very good paella recipe.
And I'm waiting to be invited over to share it with you.
We're there and we're there. But then we have into that nasty area of food regulation and custom and shellfish and what you can eat and what you can't eat. What is it the preoccupation the religions have with food origins?
But one thing that's extremely important that not many of my colleagues want to talk about, and that is the regulations in the Torah were about public health. They weren't dictated by God because it would be good or bad for you. If you take each of the injunctions about take your drinking water upstream from your latrines, don't eat shellfish. Don't eat pork. If you look at and go one by one, you'll go, that's all public health. This has nothing to do with pleasing God or pleasing yourself. The reason it was attached to God was to make people pay attention. Nothing to do with God. None of the restrictions about sacred cows or not mixing milk and meat. As you take them, talk to somebody from the FDA, talk to a nutritionist. And what are they telling us now about Thanksgiving turkeys and stuffing and leaving potato salad out at a picnic? It's all about public health and contamination. And every single one of the rules in the Torah, you can find them, everyone.
And yet, I have eaten many a paella with shrimp and all kinds of shellfish in it. And I have yet to die. At least I am not a zombie as far as I know. And is there ever been any effort or consideration to the possibility of saying or changing the laws so that never eat shellfish unless they're fresh caught or some other caveat to it, as
Well,
far as you know?
remember, we have all kinds of public health laws. You can't change the religion. So the kosher laws are so ingrained that, and there's no Jewish law. So there's no one to change it. It's all made up. And for that reason, nobody wants to listen to, well, it's really about safety, it's really about public health. But if you see it as a way to identify as Jewish, that's fine. But
At the
don't,
same time, quinoa is now okay as a grain during Passover.
that's because the Sfardim ate it. And because they were Jewish and there was a long term record of them eating it, it kind of weaseled its way in. Look, you cannot cook a chicken in its mother's milk. I don't care how hard you try. And so, but that hasn't stopped the Orthodox from saying, no, you can't have milk with chicken.
And yet, somewhere there's a tribe somewhere that used to eat lobster rolls every Saturday afternoon. I'm sure if we gave a little research effort, we'd come up with them. But eating in general, this preoccupation with what you can eat and what you can't eat. Recently, a famous political figure made mention of something that horrified some about eating pets. And yet, I have a favorite writer who says you should choose your pet based on whether or not it has meaty hindquarters in case of tough times.
You know, I've always said that Garfield in the Walk would be very, very tasty, Joe. And I think that we want to look at some of our household pets. In times of famine, all the dogs disappeared. During the Second World War, during some of the sieges, all the rats disappeared, all the dogs disappeared, all the cats disappeared. It was survival. Eating, but eating becomes a cultural event. And there are certain animals, pets in particular, that we don't raise for food. You know, no one would blink an eye at eating a chicken, a calf, a pig, but to say we should raise dogs is it's something about the culture that defines things. And what we're seeing now is it's used as a weapon. We're not talking about survival and culture. We're talking about demonizing people based on American culture where our pets are not to be eaten.
I understand that some people think it's uncomfortable. The big question for about a dozen years back in the 80s was horse meat.
Yes, it still is. Every so often I read an article in France. I'm not quite sure what the current status is on horse meat in France.
And of course, Texas was the big state to come out against it because you don't take somebody's horse in Texas for any reason, let alone to make it into a sandwich. But again, here is where the vegetarian steps in and says, we should not be eating any animals at all in an effort to be at one with the universe and with the creator. Where does Judaism stand on that?
Well, Judaism does take a stand. We're not allowed to eat trigger burgers. So that takes horse meat off. You can't cook Garfield in the wok, so that takes cats off. Um, Dogs, no. But again, Joe, if we go back to Jewish law and the restrictions, it's all about health. Nothing to do with culture, society. Remember, Judaism grew up in the desert, in the Middle East, without refrigeration. And so when we look at foods, when we look at what the Inuit eat, when we look at what the natives of different countries eat, it's all about the climate, the latitude, the temperature, and putting spices on meat, salting food in order to preserve it. There's it all comes down to public health and safety. But once something's in effect, Joe, it really is not just unfair and unreasonable, not just cruel. I don't even know a word for attacking a group of people when you make it up fictionally, claiming that they're eating something that we as Americans consider something you don't eat. And that's a very different level than what you and I have been talking about so far.
That's true. And there are lots of ways we could go on this conversation, but there's only one way for me, Rabbi, and that's to thank you for your insight. I will make you a paella one of these days. I've been challenged with the idea of making a kosher paella, and I haven't come up with a solution yet. But regardless of that, I welcomed you to my table as I do every Sunday. Thank you for your wisdom.
And I would remind you that in the Bay Colony, lobster was so plentiful, nobody really wanted to eat it because they're bugs. It was fed to prisoners in jail. And even the prisoners objected to getting too much lobster to eat. And there were complaints and letters in the literature to the leaders of the Bay Colony to stop feeding prisoners in jails lobster.